So I believe we read verses 24 through 32 of Romans number 5, as it's titled there on the top of page 11. Let's go ahead and read that again, and then we'll get into our study this evening. If someone could read for me Romans chapter 1, verses 24 through 32.
Because they did these things, God left them and let them go their sinful way, wanting only to do evil. As a result, they became full of sexual sin, using their bodies wrongly with each other. They traded the truth of God for a lie. They worshipped and served what had been created instead of God who created those things and should be praised forever. Because people did these things, God left them and let them do the shameful things that they wanted to do. Women stopped having natural sex and started having sex with other women. In the same way, men stopped having natural sex and began wanting each other. Men did shameful things with other men, and in their bodies they received the punishment for those wrongs. People did not think it was important to have a true knowledge of God, so God left them and allowed them to have their own worthless thinking and do the things that they should not do. They are filled with every kind of sin, evil, selfishness, and hatred. They are full of jealousy, murder, fighting, lying, and thinking the worst of each other. They gossip and they say evil things about each other. They hate God, they are rude and conceited and brag about themselves. They invent ways of doing evil, they do not obey their parents. They are foolish, they do not keep their promises, and they show no kindness or mercy to others. They know God's law says these things, those who live like this should die, but they themselves not only continue to do these evil things, they applaud others who will do them as well.
All right, thank you so much. So, again, we see their progression, the state that they eventually arrived at, that it was not something that God had put them in. Those words, God also gave them up, verses 24, 26, and 28. But in their own seeking after self-pleasure and self-satisfaction, that's where they wound up. Idolatry is something that is extremely confusing and causes us to become, in a way, like a dog chasing his own tail, literally, thinking that that's our prize, that's what we're after. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're worshiping themselves, they're worshiping what they're creating and what they're making, but they're not worshiping God. And in the process of this, they then go down a path of more and more wickedness and more immorality. They are filled with unrighteousness. They are filled with fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness. They're full of envy, murder, debate, deceit. They are backbiters. They hate God. They're proud, despiteful, boasters, inventor of evil things, disobedient to parents. When you read this, does it really sound much different than a lot of what we're facing and up against today? A lot of the behavior that we see around us that continues to intensify is along these lines. And when certain actions and decisions are taken, I've known of certain cases where brethren have sent to leaders or folks in power in society this very chapter, because they think they're making a decision that is somehow tolerant and acceptable and approved, and usually it's surrounding topics such as homosexuality. And leaders and folks that are in power today are completely removed from these concepts and from these instructions and these warnings that God has given us. And so when we look at the state of sin and we look at the state of culture and we see the various connecting behaviors, it's not very different from where the Gentiles eventually arrived. Let's look here at this first question on page 12. What is idolatry? What is idolatry? And while we're answering this, let's refer back to point A under Roman numeral 2. They had no higher concept of God than themselves. We have to always be careful to remember God is nothing, well, He's not nothing like us, but we are incorrect when we begin saying or thinking to ourselves that, well, God's just like I am. We are created in God's image, and so in that way we are made likened unto God. But His majesty, His power, His authority, His righteousness, His purity is something that sets Him apart. He is sanctified. Let's go to Psalm 50 and verse 21. Psalm 50 and verse 21, and if someone could read that for me.
These things you have done, and I have been silent. You thought that I was one like yourself. But now I rebuke you and lay the charge before you.
Okay, so God is rebuking them because they had been under the impression that God was altogether such an one as them. We need to have a reverential fear regarding God. He is a consuming fire. Note Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 29. So our view of God and our recognition that He is sanctified, that He is pure, it's not that He's out of touch. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that God is oblivious to what's going on. There's a balance in trying to make sure we are not saying various erroneous doctrines out there. But God is also not anything like idols and like the greatness that we sometimes perceive within our own selves. Doesn't come anywhere close. And so we can all ask ourselves the question, how do we view God? Do we put Him up on a pedestal? Is He elevated in our minds? Is He exalted? Is He unreproachable, not in the sense that He cannot be approached, because thankfully we're able to approach Him because of the blood of Christ. Note Hebrews chapter 4, verses 12 to the end of the chapter. But He is to be viewed in such a reverential way that we acknowledge His greatness and His awe-inspiring majesty. And so I think we can all do ourselves good from time to time to really reflect upon how we view God in our minds, how we approach God, how we understand His greatness, and that can help us maintain faithfulness and avoid this idolatrous type of thinking where we really worship God in the way that we think God wants to be worshipped based on the way that we think we would want to be worshipped. It's just a circle. Again, it's like a dog chasing its tail. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, and if someone could read for me there, verse 5.
Therefore put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desires, and covetousness, which is idolatry.
Okay, so covetousness is idolatry. And you see likewise the other behaviors mentioned there in verse 5. It's very similar to what's described for us in Romans chapter 1. So this type of behavior is one that's all around us and is one that we have to be ever mindful of. So going back to the question, is humanism a form of idolatry? We did a sermon on humanism several weeks ago, looking at the Humanist Manifesto. There's several of them. And we went into some details regarding their theories and their beliefs. What really is the idea of humanism, and how has it penetrated and seeped through our culture and society?
Everybody's kind of their own little God.
Everyone's their own little God, is that what you said?
And there's no higher being. It's just up to the humans to govern themselves and take care of everything. And there's no supernatural power or deity that needs to be sought after.
Sure, absolutely. What were you saying, George?
I was going to say, our thought, we have to put our thoughts above God's thoughts.
Sure. Because we make ourselves God.
We make ourselves our own God.
Our own God. Right, absolutely, little g God. And before we look at how that's seeped into our culture, is that new? I mean, obviously we see it here in Romans 1, which is being a reference to the Gentiles. And we're about to get into Romans 2. Well, actually, I don't know if we'll get into Romans 2, this study of Romans. But at some point, Lord willing, we will. But is it new or isolated just to the Gentile people? There's no new sin, and we see many examples of this kind of behavior. Again, it's being referenced here, but not only did the Gentiles behave in this way, but who else behaved in this way?
The Jews.
God's children, the children of Israel, behaved in this way. Look at Judges chapter 17, and look with me there in verse 6. Judges chapter 16 and verse 6.
16 or 17?
17. Did I say 16? Judges 17 verse 6. Am I off? In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Judges 17 and verse 6. Notice also Judges 21 and verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. I'm thankful for the freedoms we have in this country, and I don't want those freedoms to go away, ever. But sometimes I wonder if because our government is set up in a way to give us freedoms where there is not a centralized position of authority, although of course the federal government seeks after it continuously, if that causes us to behave in a very similar manner. Well, there's no king over us, in that there's limited powers within government, and so we just do whatever's right in our own eyes. We're not having to be concerned with meeting the requirements given to us by some authoritative figure, and so we can all just be our own gods. Sometimes I wonder if that's one of the challenges that we have in this society. It certainly has been the foundation of humanism, pointed out just a few moments ago by George and Gail. How has that idea seeped into society, and what areas and what places has it seeped into society?
Everything, just about.
I mean, really,
It'd be easier to name the things
that it hasn't, which I don't know what we'd name. Because unfortunately, even in the Lord's church, right? You're right. Everything is the point. I think probably the easiest place to go is school systems. School systems now teach things such as dignity in dying, promote things such as abortion and sexual experimentation, stripping morality out of any type of educational foundation with an effort to define via our own selves, and because we as humans exist, that we can come to a, quote, common good and understand what is correct. But yet, again, murdering and killing people. It's definitely in our government and in certain programs. Read a tweet today that said something along the lines of Planned Parenthood being an essential program for this country, and that thousands of lives would be threatened if it were to be stripped of its funding. What about all the lives that it aids in aborting? Do those lives matter? It's very interesting, the tweet. But this is the idea. The idea is that as humans, we can define for ourselves what is good and what is acceptable. And in doing that, then hypocrisy rises and inconsistencies occur. I think we could spend a lot of time here talking in all kinds of different ways. Our higher education systems, the pursuit of a PhD really boils down to, can you make a name for yourself? Is there some kind of way that you can bring value to the human race and to the body of knowledge and coming up with something new? Just that very concept alone is dangerous, because folks pursue that very benefit that comes with a PhD to the point where they come up with a lot of really crazy things. Where you have to be educated beyond your intelligence in order to understand. And that's the point in which they reach. Think about even our medical systems. Not only Planned Parenthood, but other things that occur. Mentioned dignity in dying is being taught in schools. You have quote, assisted suicide being legal in certain states, such as Oregon. These are practices that are being encouraged in medicinal areas because the idea is that man, again, can create his own law. What do you think that really all boils down to? What does abortion and what does dignity in dying really all boil down to?
Murder.
Ultimately, that's what it is. But what is their justification?
It's a convenience for them,
It's a convenience, and a lot
for others,
for others,
they're taking
I'll
care of
say,
it.
and it's all self. And a lot of times, it all also boils down to money.
Exactly.
Because the government has to pay for folks who are older in the hospital, and the government then has to decide whether or not those lives are valuable. And the same is true with babies that are being born out of wedlock and in certain situations where they're highly likely to be dependent upon government aid. A lot of times you can just follow the money. And you can see some of the reasoning behind all this. So again, it's when you depart God's law for selfish reasons, and for your own, based upon your own wisdom, you're going to end up confused and lost, just like these folks were in Romans chapter 1. Any other comments here on question 1? Humanism, idolatry, etc.
you know, to me, John, anything we put above God is idolatry. In my own life, if I put anything above God in my life, that's my idol.
Right. God told the Jewish people in Exodus chapter 20, "Thou shalt have no other God before me." And that's what you're referring to. They thought and tried to justify and say, well, that means we can be idolatrous just as long as God comes first.
Secondary gods.
Right, secondary gods. And I know that this is exactly, I know this is what you're referring to, George. I'm clarifying it. Sometimes folks get this idea that, well, as long as I can take care of God's things, put some checks in the boxes, then I can run over here and take care of my covetousness, and I can take care of my fornication and my evil concupiscence or evil desires, because I put God first, He's done, and now I can go over here and take care of all this other stuff. Well, that's the same thing that the Jews did. And what George is referring to, and really what's being stated when those kinds of comments are made, is that God is our life. He isn't in a position, but He is at the very core of who we are striving to be and what it is we are living for. Paul says this, I think we reviewed this last week, Colossians chapter 3 again, beginning in verse 2, "Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with Him in glory." You know, we studied Sunday morning conditional statements by God. This is a conditional statement. How is it that we are going to appear with Christ in glory? What must exist? God must be our life. Not first in our life, not our priority, but He must be our life. Why I do what I do? Because of God. And sometimes we run the risk of, and notice there, verse 5, isn't it interesting? We just read 2 through 4. Verse 5 right after that then is getting into idolatry. But it's challenging. It's before us continuously. All these other priorities, all these other concerns that we have, constantly bombarding us and tempting us to put it before God, in the sense that we allow that to take over a part of our life, and just put God in a pecking order, if you will. Any other comments here on question 1?
What do you think of a church that, on Christmas, they don't have services because they're giving their members a day off? Or on, Memorial Day weekend, they do the same thing.
Sure.
And it's a church here in Metro.
Sure.
When I heard that, I'm confused
Right.
about what they're doing.
Correct.
And they said it's a guilt-free Sunday.
Right.
Sunday.
Because they have given them they've given them it all.
Right. You know,
I don't get it.
you know, it's interesting because, you know, denominationalism came out of the church. I mean, it wasn't ordained by God. But the first denominational body that ever existed existed because the church fell away. And so that's nothing new, this idea. And it really, if you extrapolate that out, what it really boils down to is, if it's a guilt-free Sunday, essentially what that's saying is, it's a Catholicism doctrine, holy days of obligation. In other words, you're segmenting and you're defining, separate from the Word of God, certain requirements while removing others based upon your own opinion and ideas. And that is exactly what the Catholic Church has done. Holy days of obligation are days that Catholic people must attend. They can't miss. Meaning the other days are guilt-free. And that's why Christmas and Easter, you know, it's interesting, it's almost reverse. But Christmas and Easter are the days that, everybody's there. Everybody's there. We can never make God convenient. It's not possible. We can't be a Christian. There's no such thing as a convenient Christian. That's the point. And that's the point George is making. That's the point Tress is making. That's the point really a lot of folks have made. It's impossible to be a Christian by convenience. That's how the gospel is set up. Let me ask you this. Was it possible for the gospel to come to fruition out of convenience? What was the convenient route for the gospel? Jesus not going to the cross. What was the convenient route for the apostles? We're not spreading this. Look what happened to our Lord, and look at what's already happened to some of us. No way. There's nothing about Christianity that equals convenience. That's not what it is. It is sacrifice. It is sacrifice. Now, again, just balancing, it is scriptural sacrifice. In other words, the opposite of that, and just balancing this out, is, well, if you're really a Christian, then not only are you going to come, on the days that the elders have set aside, but you're going to make sure that you set your alarm at 6 a.m. every day, and you're going to read your Bible for 30 minutes. And if you don't do that, then you're not a Christian. And and so on and so forth. It's a little bit of the Boston movement to a degree, but again, that's nothing new. It was happening back in the first century as well. Jesus tells us, we've studied this before together as well, Luke 9 and verse 23, if any man come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. That doesn't sound like convenience. That doesn't sound like guilt-free at all. And so we cannot loose and we cannot bind. Revelation chapter 22, verse 18, for verily I testify unto every man that heareth the words of the prophecy of this book, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of this book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life and out of the holy city and from the things which are written in this book. That's not the only place in the Bible where these kinds of words are recorded. Note Proverbs chapter 30, verses 3 through 6, and Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2. So, elders have a responsibility to look out for the weakest member of the flock. And that's a hard task to do. Very hard. But the responsibility is to oversee the flock, feeding them as God has commanded, Acts chapter 20, verse 28, and preventing them from being eaten by wolves. And, it's sad because you can think of the intention there of folks that would make such a decision. But they are misguided and in error, unfortunately. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 through 25 doesn't say, and Acts chapter 20, verse 7 doesn't say, unless the elders deem otherwise. That's not a call they can make. And the congregation really should approach them about it and ask them about it. And you said it's local in this area, in Atlanta? Well, it's nothing new either, because it's spreading like wildfire. And one of our neighbors, Rubel Shelley, and his disciples are part of the reason for it. It's unfortunate. Any other comments here on question 1?
This whole discourse in the last part of Romans seems to be a essay on Solomon's statement in Ecclesiastes 7:29, where he says, God hath made man upright, but he has sought out many inventions. Well, what are those inventions? Well, it seems here to give a history of how those inventions came about and falling away.
That was Ecclesiastes 7, and which one?
29.
29. Oh, yep. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions.
And the thing about this part of Romans is it's a universal truth, and being a universal truth, it's repeatable in history.
Right.
And you can read about it today. You could read about it 1,000 years ago, 2,000. Anytime you read it, it's true in history because it's a universal truth. And it brings to mind the thought that those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it. It's more true of sin than it is of history.
Sure. Those who do not know sin are more apt to repeat it. Sure. And just, inventions and seeking out, ideas and new ways of doing things. Let me ask you this. Are there areas in our life that creativity is allowed?
Sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me ask you this. We were created in God's own image. Is God creative?
More than we can imagine.
I mean, look at the trees out there. It's phenomenal, right?
Created the whole world.
Created the whole world. And so sometimes, I think about this with our children. We have some children who are extremely creative. We have other children who are, who struggle with creativity. And sometimes as adults, I think we fail to realize where the boundaries are, and we sometimes create boundaries that are not there, and we other times lose boundaries that are clearly there. And areas of creativity and opportunities for invention in the sense of just making things and coming up with new ideas is in no way something that is unacceptable, as long as it is within the bounds of God. And unfortunately, folks are not satisfied with being creative and being innovative and inventive, not from a morality standpoint, but just from a product standpoint or idea standpoint. But that's not enough. They want to actually push outside of God's law, outside of God's boundaries, and begin creating in their mind something that's brand new, and none of it's new either. That's the thing. And here's the other point: it never stops. There's no end. In this same letter, Ecclesiastes 5, in verse 10, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. There is no end to an effort to fill ourselves with those things that are vain. And as we seek to fill ourselves with things that are vain, we think we need more things that are vain in order to fill ourselves, and it just causes us to go farther and farther and farther and farther. And we're not satisfied when we gain acceptance and approval from the things that we are trying to be inventive and creative about when it comes to morality. It's not a great article, it's a great illustration of what it is we're describing here. I think it was in the New York Times, but I may be wrong. Almost immediately after the Supreme Court ruled on homosexual marriage, quote, and it basically said, this isn't fun anymore. I mean, if you want to boil the article down, that's essentially what it said. It said, we used to have all these secret hideouts. There were little places in Boston and New York, and it was a secretive club, and there was a lot of camaraderie and a lot of unity and a lot of gusto about our cause. But now that the Supreme Court has approved it all,
It's everywhere.
we don't care anymore. That's no longer fun. It's lost its meaning. And it was only shortly after that, by the way, that I think it was in the New Yorker, I believe, I began seeing articles on bestiality. And so it doesn't end. It just, there's a there is no invention, quote, that satisfies. And even recently, there's been more and more behavior that I've seen that is literally idolatrous. I mean, there's singers that have certain acts and performances that literally, I mean, it's idolatrous. It's idolatry. It's what it is. And that's become acceptable. That's become, in some circles, common now.
And it's more prevalent. Everything you see on the news, on TV shows, on the radio, there's homosexuality everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, when I was young, you never heard about it.
Right.
And
Right.
now it's, and then I heard something on the news the other day where downtown Atlanta, they're painting some of the crosswalks in the colors of it. And I thought, why do you have to paint the colors
Right.
that they claim are theirs? No,
Right.
it's just,
Rainbows.
right, it's just sickening.
Right.
I just get sick when I see, I turn on and I don't watch things that are crazy. I watch the cooking shows 90%. But I mean, every one of them, there's somebody that's
Right.
homosexual.
Well, and it's a very aggressive behavior. We've studied and noted before that, again, to Ron's point, history shows us this as well. We see clearly the behaviors of homosexuality laid out for us in Genesis chapter 19, the way in which they behaved. The men of the city, verse 4, even the men of Sodom compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot and said unto him, where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us that we may know them. I mean, they are aggressive.
Well, in Sodom and Gomorrah.
It was. And we're going to have to get more and more knowledgeable and more equipped as to how to deal with it. Because to Sharon's point, it is everywhere. I mean, it's
In the workplace.
in the workplace.
I work-
Companies and corporations push it. You have flags and flag days, and we value diversity, not diversity of thought. We value diversity in regards to areas that are not sensible. And Our children, our grandchildren, and even us are going to be needing to know how to respond and react and behave more and more and more, and situationally prepare ourselves for those kinds of interactions, because it's going to become more and more prevalent. And when we're prepared, we're able to deal with it a little bit better. Okay, number 2. What is uncleanness? What is the daily practice of the majority in America today? See Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. Can one read or watch anything he wants and keep his mind pure? What does Philippians 4 and verse 8 have to say concerning television, books, movies, and other media? Is there even a recognition by our society today of what uncleanness is? Do you think if you went up to someone on the street randomly or someone at a college town and said, hey, can you describe for me some things that would be considered unclean from a morality perspective? Do you think they'd even know what to say?
They'd look at you like you were crazy.
You're right.
Nothing's unclean. It's unclean to be a Christian. That's probably what they'd say. That's how they've been taught. Let's pick up here on question 2, Lord willing, next week. And I think we have one more class, and then we're done with Romans.